So let me shortly introduce Monica Nerland, and I'm very, very happy that you are here. I'm looking forward to listen to you in some seconds. Monica is a professor at the Department of Education at the University of Oslo in Norway. She has conducted research on teaching, learning, and knowledge development across disciplinary and professional programs. Monica is currently the leader of the research group Headwork for Studies in Higher Education. She was part of the Quality of Norwegian Higher Education research group, which investigated aspects that matter for educational quality in educational practices, focusing on course environment that employed study-centered approaches. Dear Monica, I'm very happy to welcome you here to the DGHD 19, and may I now ask you to come on stage for the opening keynote on enhancing student learning in changing knowledge environments, opportunities and challenges for higher education. Please.
Dear Minister, dear leaders and colleagues in the academic development community of Germany, if that's a proper translation. I'm very honored to be invited to talk to this community, which is impressive in size and also in the activities, I would say. Coming from a small country up north, this is really a big group of people engaging in the Hochschuledidaktik, and it's really important work. So this is a true honor. I will use two research projects we have conducted in Norway as basis for my talk. So I will look at this from a researcher's perspective, where we have been engaged in trying to understand in broad terms what are teachers and students in higher education actually doing, and how do they think and experience about what they are doing when they are engaged in teaching and learning. If we compare higher education with other parts of the educational system, we have very limited research on what actually happens in universities and Hochschule environments. There is a lot of studies in classrooms in elementary school, in the Grundschule, but higher education has been much more limited. And typically what we have from higher education research is often about inputs and output factors, and what happens in between is not really that visible to us. And it's in part related to the idea that also if people really know their subject, and if the disciplinary knowledge is secured, then the rest will happen by itself. But as I guess all of us have experienced, it's not that easy, and it's actually increasingly complex, with more diversity in the student population, and with what I'm going to make a point of here, how the knowledge environments are changing. Because we can't really assume that there is an established knowledge base in a discipline or a professional context that we can just pass on to new generations. Be prepared for work today and for lifelong careers and for learning throughout life is actually very complex. So what I will try to do, but I think I have to shorten a bit, so we'll see how far we can get, is to look first at how can we understand changes in knowledge environments and how they matter for teaching and learning in higher education. That's of course a very broad topic, so I will make some selections, and I will do so based on one of our projects in Oslo that we're interested in how students in professional programs in universities get socialized or get really into the knowledge domains they are trying to study. What mechanisms are in play in those processes, and how do teaching and learning then relate to developments in the disciplines or profession? Because this is not a stable scenario either, but it's about continuously relating to how the knowledge domain is developing when we engage newcomers into these domains. So a term I will use for this is enrollment of students in expert cultures. enrollment is then not about signing up for a course or a program, but it's about becoming mobilized into. It's a concept from network theories where you look at people and knowledge and material resources and so on as working together to bring something into being, and in this case, learning or also professional qualifications. Then I will also draw on the project that Dr. Bade mentioned, that was about quality issues in Norwegian higher education. In this case, we were interested in how do teachers and students work with teaching approaches that are not the traditional lecture format. I use the term student-centered approaches here. That is really a policy term in one sense. I'm not quite sure what is the most common term in the German setting, but it is about activating and engaging students in activities rather than as listeners to lectures and as readers only. And what happens when people try to develop other teaching approaches. And hopefully with your help we can reach some conclusions of what this can imply also for academic development. So, starting with the issue of how knowledge environments are changing. This is an image of a group of teachers, but we could easily also put other people in the center here. It could be a group of biologists, or we could substitute it with engineers or medical professionals or others. But if you look at work situations today and also what forms knowledge development in the area people are working and trying to get qualified, there is a lot of different actors that take part in generating knowledge. And the university is certainly just one of many. We see, of course, science communities and research communities developing new knowledge that hopefully also enters site of work. We also see that there are specialized agencies taking care of research-generated knowledge and work on translating this for instance, professional contexts like clearinghouses, like the Cochrane Library, to take one example. We see that there are many user groups, client groups, stakeholder groups that also organize themselves and take part in knowledge generation. In many medical domains, for instance, patient communities are really powerful, and they are also very knowledgeable, and they read the latest research, and they organize, and they put pressure on what should happen in the professional work settings. We find this also, for instance, in discussions about climate changes, in discussions about democracy, in discussions about societal development. So I won't rest with all of these type of actors, and we could even imagine more. But the point is that the number of actors involved and all the products they generate, all the type of knowledge products, makes a quite complex setting for learning and also for teaching. So, some implications of this is that we can see blurred boundaries between types of organizations, also when it comes to educational responsibilities. What should be learned in the university and what should be learned at work? Which other groups are engaging in taking on educational responsibilities? We have seen in our projects that there are signs of many types of work communities and organizations trying to be interested in the educational mandate and trying to also get a space there, which is good, but there are new coordination challenges arising, and also a need to rethink what higher education can contribute in this. Another type of implication is what I've called the epistemification of professional work, which is about increased expectations to work with knowledge in ways that are not only about applying what is known, but actually investigating things, producing, generating, validating. What kind of resources should we use here? what kind of knowledge is important for us to proceed with work, and so on. So together with the use of more complex instruments and technologies, this actually put pressure on also ways of working with knowledge, not only having knowledge or understanding knowledge. So the procedural aspects are coming strongly to the fore. And of course, procedural knowledge have always been important in professional work, but I think it's of a more recent date that you have those kind of expectations when it comes to handling knowledge itself. Investigating your own practice, developing it further with colleagues, and so on. And this leads to extended responsibilities, but also to increase specialization, because the knowledge developments are driving and pushing forward into specialization at the same time as you need to work cleverly across groups and with colleagues and coordinate things. So, how can this be prepared for in education is one issue. And one way of looking at this, I think, is to see the learning challenges, as I spotted on several boxes out in the hall here, as not really being about finding knowledge and access information, but how to make sense of it, how to make it actionable, how to be able to do with in shifting epistemic environments. So one of the starting points we have had in our research is that learning the techniques and procedures for how knowledge is handled in different fields are important to be able to engage and to be able to participate over time. And this is quite complex because it has to do with where do the knowledge come from if you are a medical practitioner or a biologist or a lawyer. What defines what to trust? How do you know that something is better than something else? It calls on what I've called also an increased epistemic reflexivity, not only in knowing the knowledge, but actually being able to assess and reflect on what status it has and what it can contribute to different tasks. So the quote here is from Saul Tobias, who has been working with the Foucauldian tradition, so it's taken from a bit of a different context. But I think the point he made is very important also for education, that practitioners can actually be totally overwhelmed of the circuits of knowledge and information today if they don't cope with how to handle it. And to be able to handle it, you need to be sufficiently embedded. And that's where we use this enrollment concept to get into the expert communities in a way that allows you to take part and being on top of it, so to speak. So some educational challenges that can be emerging from this is, first, what can higher education contribute in this? What should be the role of universities? What should be left to workplaces? How can they collaborate in qualifying people or in supporting learning throughout the life course? And also, what are the important type of qualifications to develop? One take of it is then, as I said, to look at this as also highlighting ways of working with knowledge and looking at this as enrolling students in activities where they get access to the epistemic practices of their knowledge domain. That means how do we do knowledge as a lawyer or biologist or historian or whatever. And also to be able to navigate in fields of tension where there are different voices, different advices, contesting claims that come together. And for the study programs, it is then also a challenge to find ways of keeping up with evolving fields. Education typically lags a bit behind work in one sense, but on the other hand, it's a stabilizing force, and there are ways of thinking about knowledge domains that actually should be secured and protected from the every minute changes that might go on in other contexts. So it's backdrops and also strengths with this, but how to develop productive set of relations to the work settings and with the type of knowledge development that goes on is one challenge here. So this was the starting point for the first project that I will tell you a bit about. And as a little backdrop of before we go into the results, just a brief note on how we conceptualize this issue about enrolling students. We looked at knowledge cultures, be it professional or disciplinary cultures, as something that is continuously formed by machineries of knowledge construction. I'm drawing here on a concept launched actually by Karin Knorr-Settina, familiar for some Germans and German-speaking communities, I guess. She has done a lot of work on science studies and production of knowledge in the sciences, but she has also been interested in other type of expert work, and some of her concepts are useful, I think, to look into this knowledge dynamics issue and then related to teaching and learning. So by looking at this machinery notion, it doesn't mean that it is a machine, but it is this collection of many actors, many activities, many voices that comes together to continuously produce and make up how we know what we know, as she says. This is something that spans organizational boundaries because it's knowledge fields in development. So it has their work representatives, their higher education communities, and many other actors on time. And the point is also that these knowledge cultures are made and remade again and again and again through people's actions and the way people engaged. And in this, both teachers and students in higher education are, of course, key people. We all use the epistemic practices concept to go deeper into how people get into their different knowledge cultures as students and teachers. And this is a concept that highlights the practices, ways of doing in the community, but looks specifically then at ways of doing and handling knowledge. It has been picked up in recent years also in the learning sciences. So Kelly here, for instance, and also Lina Markauskaite and Peter Goodyear from the University of Sydney has worked a lot with these notions to understand both student learning and professional learning more generally. So these practices are distinct for each knowledge domain, but at the same time they have something in common. So it's about generating knowledge, assessing knowledge, sharing knowledge, distributing, and making knowledge actionable in different situations. And finally, we used the concept of epistemic objects, also with the inspiration from science studies and Karin Knorr-Settina, to look at this type of problems that people in a community try to work on. It could be, for instance, the concept of justice in law, the concept of care in the health sector. It could be ideas about adaptive teaching or inclusive teaching in teacher education. It's kind of problems that people in the knowledge domain work on again and again and try to understand and try to grasp, but it's never completed. You never reach the point that now it's all resolved. So these are objects of attention that are shared in the communities, to which also knowledge gets attached. So people develop knowledge and share knowledge to deal with these problems. And the reason we got interested in this is that we wanted to look at how do engagement with these objects make enrollment possible for students. So we see this as a key mechanism in introducing students to the expert cultures. Yeah, I will skip that one and go into the very project. The project context is a 4-year project that we completed a few years back called Horizontal Governance and Learning Dynamics in Higher Education. And we focused on 3 profession-oriented programs that all of them are taught in university settings in Norway. So the teacher education here is a 5-year program leading to a master degree, educating people for teaching in secondary school system. And the reason we were interested in the professional context is that these are complex in the relationship between education and work, and with different also types of knowledge. The questions we asked are very much related to the concepts I just presented briefly. How are students enrolled in their prospective expert cultures through the educational activities in the program? And sub-questions, how do they take part in epistemic practices and object exploration? And from there, how do these practices and objects also link students to the wider professional or disciplinary culture, which exists not only in the study program, but out there, also often with an international outreach. We wanted to look into what happens in the educational activities. So this was observation-based research, where we conducted participant observation of teaching and teacher-led lectures and seminars, but we also followed students in their work, in colloquium groups, in study groups, in different type of discussion groups. And we videotaped the students' work and discussions to get into how they actually worked on the tasks and what resources they mobilized and where difficulties then showed up. And yeah, we conducted analysis on different levels, but we used interaction analysis to really trace the microprocesses, but we also looked at interview data and outcomes of the courses. I will give one example that is from the introductory courses, because we entered courses in different phases of these programs and did several case studies of this, but we also compared a bit across, and this is taken from the very first introductory courses in the 3 programs. All of these 3 programs, they emphasized inquiry activities in the first courses, and the reason for this was that they saw this as very important to introduce students to the knowledge domain early on in the program. And that means that they used approaches in which the students also engaged in exploring and constructing knowledge products and worked in active ways. In teacher education and in the law program, the students were placed in groups to work on case analysis, in which the cases were taken from kind of authentic situations from real professional life, and they were to investigate these cases and bring on knowledge resources to resolve problems. The engineers typically had a bit of a different task. They were to develop something, so this was a task of developing a web page in their case. And we wanted then to look at what kind of epistemic type of practices and objects were introduced here. And I've highlighted in the second column here of epistemic practices different terms for these ways of working with knowledge that we can see are different across the domains. while for instance, the teacher education students were very engaged in formulating an inquiry question to investigate something and produce an academic report, the law students were to solve a judicial case by learning how to sort a case, see what the conflict is about, how to employ legal methodology to work on this. I will give you some brief examples before I come back to this. If you look at the legal education course, the focus was very much on legal methodology. And it's still kind of not quite clear to us what that means. And when we discuss it with the legal professionals, they are also saying that this is a contested field and everybody knows in one sense what it is, but explaining it is hard. So how on earth can a student understand what it is? But they also highlighted from the teacher side already from the very first start that being updated on what happened in the Supreme Court and in current law is actually important. It's not the textbook that is your syllabus, it's current law. And the course was organized in a way where students were to work on different type of professional resources each day to solve their case narrative. So they started with their common sense, but then they went into using statutes, using court decisions, and in the very end they were presented to the textbook, but they were not allowed to use that before they came to the end. So just to look in a few examples of how enrollment took place. This is a transcribed session from a student group in the beginning. And the story was about a young couple that went on holiday. They were a really fresh couple. They borrowed money from the mothers, one of the mothers, to buy a car. The car broke down, so they didn't get to their rental home. And even when they come back, the car was actually stolen because the keys were put in the ignition. And it was a lot of different judicial conflicts within this. But what is interesting here, I think, is that the students try to stop the discussion very early. Like the last quote here with student 1 said, "It is decided. I will note that the reparation fee should be divided between Halvard, which is the guy in the story, and a boy who stole and broke the car. So we have solved the case." And all of this is in kind of everyday language. This is how they discussed it in the last session. If you start with the basic question, is this a defective car? You would start with section 17 in the Consumer Act. What does it say again? It says, if the condition described in section 16, subsection 1, letter C are fulfilled, section 17 should apply, and so on. So the whole language is totally transformed. And this is actually 4 days later than the first extract. So this is an illustration of how these students were mobilized into the knowledge domain by using the professional resources of the field, of the Consumer Act, of these sections, subsections, letter C, and so on. Very brief example, but still telling. I will skip the teacher education here and show just one example from the engineering case, where the focus was very much about learning to handle programming tools and to use type of tools and resources that were openly available on the web, basically, and that are also used by professional programmers. So the students here, they were imitating coding patterns that were used by professionals. They used validation tools through which they could kind of spit their code through and see if it worked, and different types of developer tools. And this is also a transcript from a group discussion where the group is now trying to program this web page, and I've underlined here different examples of professional resources that were mobilized in their work to try to get hold of the task. So it's a JavaScript, it's an ID, it's a jQuery, professional developer language and tools. So going back to this one, we saw that the mechanisms of enrolling students are quite different in the different programs. Methodological principles in the legal program serve to introduce the students to see the world through the legal vocabulary and resources. In teacher education, it was more conceptual knowledge and learning theories. I didn't rest with that example now, but that was another way of introducing the students to this. And in the engineering type of example, it was these programming activities and programming tools. And what we can see, or what we saw in these studies, is that in the two programs that had this procedural emphasis in the legal program and the engineering program, they actually linked the students directly up with the professional world through the resources and tasks utilized. While in the teacher education program, they were a bit more cut off because they had to kind of work with conceptual knowledge in their textbook, but they weren't directly in contact with schools or teaching communities in this way. So we saw different ways of making these connections, but also that working with the epistemic practices of the domain can be a powerful link to introduce students to these wider knowledge worlds. So some conclusions in this is that we see that educational programs are much more than instructional settings, but they also link students with knowledge and practices in the wider professional or disciplinary culture. And the way these links are set up and maintained can be seen as a quality issue of study programs and of teaching and learning environments. To make it even more complicated, this also means that the students engage in very different knowledge settings in their learning. So if we are to understand their learning, it's a lot more than what the programs offers. For instance, these engineering students that are out on the web and using professional tools, very important for their learning, but not always visible for the teacher, and not always accounted for in assessment. So what does it actually mean for enhancing teaching and learning that these links are quite complex and can be set up in very many ways? I think now, due to the time, that I will skip the little discussion exercise with you, but you can think about it, what it means for what academic developers can support teachers in doing in developing the quality of teaching and learning. So I will use just a few minutes on the other project, which is about these student-centered or student-engaging learning environments and what experiences teachers and students have with trying to work in such environments. This is one way of looking at the term student-centered learning environments, taken here from Land and Hanafin and Oliver's book, titled The Theoretical Foundations of Learning Environments. So these are from educational design, learning sciences, instructional design areas. And the red color here is my summary of an argument in the book, not a direct quote, but it's about highlighting how students get to work on real-world problems, getting practical experiences, take ownership of their inquiry processes, but they shouldn't be left totally alone. They should really have guided activities and support from the teachers, and also being able to activate previous experiences and build their knowledge in that way. The whole idea with student-centered learning environments is also to then do a learner-centered focus on the activities, and it implies also delegating responsibilities to students for the activities. And then again, it actualizes back to the teachers, what does this mean for teaching? Because that is not to leave the room, it's to reorganize the teaching role. So we can see that one way of looking at this is to move the focus from pure teaching to organizing learning environments for the students and supporting activities therein. From pure teaching to guidance of inquiry processes, and emphasis on what resources are made available for students, what type of models, what type of support do they have available in their learning. What we did in this project that was called Quality of Norwegian Higher Education was that we were interested in how do teachers and students actually experience these more student-active ways of working, and what are they doing? The project as such was a big project, but we have, from what is called part C of the project, conducted case studies in 8 different higher education courses. This report is in English, by the way, so it's possible to look at, with a lot of co-researchers involved. And we entered 8 different courses in different Norwegian institutions, some at bachelor level and some at master level, in which they engaged students through various types of methods. We had project-based learning, problem-based learning, simulation exercises, an online program. We had research activities in law. We have role plays of different kinds. So there was a variety of type of approaches. So the research questions was kind of descriptive, because we wanted to know what are actually happening here and what are the experiences with it. So what teaching approaches are used, how are students engaged through this, and what challenges do teachers and students face. And to sum up a bit briefly, what we saw was that when teachers try to work in more student-active ways, it is a tendency that the course plans and the activities become overloaded, because these activities are often added without other things removed. So perhaps they have equally many lectures still, even if they have a lot of student activities. And they have a lot of different tasks, assignments, things that should count on the exam. But there is not always an awareness that these different tasks ask the student to do different things. Some tasks are memorizing textbook stuff tasks, and others are solving these work problem tasks. That is very different ways of working with knowledge and how to be a good student. And it's not always articulated what it means, either for teachers or students. So I really see a clear role for the Hochschuledidaktiker in assisting in looking at course plans and ways of handling this, so that the complexity is not too overloaded, but that there is kind of a focus that can be developed over time. We also saw that it's very difficult to plan the processes, because when you delegate more responsibilities to the students, you are really depending on them participating as you have planned. Students don't do that. They leave lectures, they didn't understand what you thought they should understand, or they do something totally different because they find it interesting. So having the flexibility to adjust and to cope with unexpected events is important. And it's also very important to articulate expectations and describe why are we now doing this in this way, so that there is a shared understanding of what is the rationale behind the activities, which again requires both understanding of teaching, of learning, and the knowledge domain. So it needs a Hochschuledidaktiker. Yeah? Also when students are engaged in many ways, do you know what they are doing in their parallel courses? Or do 4 teachers now expect the maximum workload in the same week? We saw some signs that this was not always coordinated. It was also a challenge to create progression in the activities. How do you actually build up ways of working? We have a lot of principles for having progression in what you know in a domain, but how you work, How do you do project-based work? How do you do project-based learning? How do you do problem solving on a higher skill in third year than in first year is a challenge. So, yeah. Sorry, this is a bit fast, but I will round up now very briefly. So this leads to actually also a need to look at the coherence across courses, which again require teacher collaboration and perhaps also leadership on the program level to be able to see how things come together in the whole life of being a student and a learner in higher education today. And we really need planning, but we need planning with space for flexibility. So, for instance, if learning outcomes descriptions become really tight, it might be very challenging to do adjustments on the way. And communicating the rationale. So, I think all of this means that we need to expand the conception of teaching, that the planning activities are really important for teachers to take care of, but that also requires collaboration. And it means that we need expertise, both in teaching, in learning, and in the knowledge domain to organize productive learning environments, and finding ways to making the contract with students, the social contract, visible, so that people know what is expected from them, and also why, so that the rationale for activities are more or less clear. So I will stop there. It's possible to read more of the things that I jumped a bit too fast over. And I'm sorry that we didn't have time to the discussion sessions for among you, but I hope that can take place in the break or later during the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your rather intense and focused presentation. And I'm not going to talk too long, but instead offering you all the possibility to get your questions out and ask Monica on her two very interesting projects. So, who has a question? Robert, of course. Robert, I just... Hello, Robert. Okay, is there anyone with a microphone? Yeah.
Oh. Am besten aufstehen, dann weiß ich, wo ich hin muss.
Thank you for your very interesting talk. I was wondering, you described about you talked about the enrollment practices and how you researched on this and your results. And I was wondering, what does this mean for faculty or educational developers who work with the disciplines or in the disciplines? So would you conclude, for example, from your studies and from your research that they should also focus on the epistemological basis or ways of creating thinking and knowledge? Or what do you think about this? Thank you.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure I got the main points, but was it about the epistemological issues, or can you just repeat the main question? Sorry.
Yeah. So the main question would be faculty developers or educational developers who want to work with or in disciplines or with disciplinary colleagues. What does this mean, the things that you talked about, for them? What does it include?
Yeah, it was a question I had planned to ask you. But I think one issue is that I think we need to think more about teams around teaching development, and that teams need to have different types of expertise. So for academic developers or the Hochschuledidaktiker to work closely with teachers that are experts in the different domains is perhaps one model for this. And I know there is a lot of discussions also in my country whether academic developers should be grouped on the university level or whether they should work within the faculties and within the departments and how this should be organized. And things tend to move back and forth all the time between those models, I'm sure for reasons. So, but complementary teams, I think, are important, and what academic developers can bring forth is actually the general understanding of teaching and learning and pedagogical approaches that can be modified and adjusted for use in specific disciplinary settings. But then I think also the disciplinary experts need to bring up what are the knowledge requirements in this course. Why do we do this? What is the important knowledge to be able to do or understand, and what implication does that have for the educational activities? So bringing this together in collaboration is better than having every person to know it all, I think, and having teams.
So thank you very much. Team teaching is a solution, obviously. I knew it all along. More questions? And please raise your hands so that we can really see them. And in case just anyone's looking at the clock and thinks that we only have 5 minutes, oh, we have more than 5 minutes left, so please don't hesitate to ask whatever comes in your mind, because this is really an opportunity, and I took down so many notes on your first and your second case, the first even more so. Yes, please. Behind there.
Yes, thanks a lot for your talk. I have a question of your research, because you spoke a lot to academics, for sure. And how did you think, were they aware of their specific epistemic expertise? Did they know what the students need to be experts in their field, or was it a bit diffuse?
Yes, thank you for that question. Experts tend to take for granted what they are themselves able to do. So quite often the kind of awareness of what are the learning challenges for students in dealing with this domain that the teacher knows so well is not always explicit and aware, something that the teachers are aware of. So we saw both versions of this. We saw also teachers that really have engaged a lot in developing teaching and assessment methods and so on, and who were quite a lot aware of what the students were struggling with. And we saw others who took it more for granted, that if I just present the content here, students will be able to do it. So, but I think this idea of really elucidating the knowledge practices was a bit new to most of the teachers, because they had a good grip on the content knowledge, but what are actually the methodological rules we follow when we do this and that in our field was not always that visible. And we also saw, for instance, that even the most experienced teachers who had really engaged a lot in developing the teaching activity tended to overlook that there were tensions in the tasks they gave to students, so that tasks asked for very different type of skills and ways of doing knowledge. In some tasks you were asked to be really critically reflexive, and in another parallel task you were asked to actually be able to repeat the knowledge without questioning it. And students were a bit confused about when is what at the play and when do they expect what from me. So yeah, one way of going further is to discuss this openly with teachers, I think, in the program development and course development.
Here's another question.
I have a question about the type of knowledge which exists in the different cultures. When I understand Knorr Cettina, right, she had a very clear look on what is implicit and what is explicit, and mostly the expert cultures reflect the explicit knowledge the scientific knowledge in their culture, but not the implicit knowledge or the implicit behavior, habits, or such socialization processes. And what does this implicit knowledge play a role in your look at the epistemic cultures?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, that's a very interesting and also big issue, I think, because cultural issues tend to be taken also for granted and becoming implicit when they are established, and social behaviors and ways of doing things are certainly among these. So, for instance, one not too strict concept but used as a metaphor by Kneusettina is this notion of epistementalities, ways of thinking about knowledge that are really something that you share in the expert culture. You have the idea of who should have access to this knowledge, who should do what can everybody do, what can only the top experts do, what can students be invited to or not. And this is often not explicated but taken more for granted. So I think that some of the challenges we saw in students trying to grasp what was expected was about this implicitness. One other example is from the law program, actually, where teachers, as I said, had also some challenges in really describing what is legal methodology and what rules to apply. And what happened in the course of our studies there is that the students went from a national setting in the legal program to international law, dealing with human rights question and conflicts in the world and so on. And international law is not regulated in the same way as the national law. In the international law, you have much more voices and stakeholders and agencies saying different things, and they don't have the legitimate status as the Supreme Court who have decided this. So there is negotiations going on. And students find it really hard to understand how to solve cases in that field because the methodological rules they were introduced to, they didn't work anymore, because they kind of require them to find that solid source that they could base their argument on. And if that source doesn't exist, things become floating. And the program's solution there was to actually recognize that this is a problem, but still we keep the exam and assessment as if the sources existed, even if they don't. So there was this kind of tension in how to resolve that. So I think it goes to social roles, but also to ways of working and what are the implicit expectations for who can do what.
Yeah, so I know I asked a question, or I want to thank you very much for your inspiring talk. I think you gave us very much inspiration, not only for the practice of Hochschuldidaktik, but also for the research. I was just talking yesterday about trying to conduct more culturalistic Hochschuldidaktik research, because we don't have that right now so much. I think you gave us very much to think about. Thank you very much. And I was thinking, as you were talking, for our practice, it's probably, did you ever think about the translation that we could enable? And I think because the people are in a knowledge teaching culture, and they have the expert cultures, and I'm not sure, and the translation between those two is not so easy, but I think with this background we could help them as academic developers, and maybe this could be a role that we do more. And I think it's a term from actor network theory as well, which is very close to Kneusettina. So I think maybe this is something we could do more research about as well.
Yeah, I think what we have done is to hold up a comparative perspective on things that are not quite comparable, right? Because there are, of course, differences in these disciplines, so they are different in the outset. But looking across makes it possible to see what is distinct for each of them, and to discuss that also with the teachers. And in our experience is that the teachers and program leaders and so on find it really interesting to see examples from another domain than their own, and then to try to compare compare and contrast themselves with what they will do in their domain. So having many examples to discuss might also be a translation device, perhaps.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a little gift for you from the organizational team. And I'm just going to give it to you, just to remember the conference you're going to be in for more than one day. Yeah, she's going to leave tomorrow in the middle of the day, something you said.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of time to be engaged in discussions on your very interesting projects. Thank you very much, and please one more applause for Monica Nerland.
Thank you.